The radar screen swore the ocean was empty, but the hair on the back of my neck screamed that we were seconds away from a collision. There is a specific silence that falls over the bridge of a warship when the world stops making sense. It's not the quiet of discipline, and it's not the quiet of sleep. It is the heavy, suffocating silence of men and women realizing that 75 years of naval technology has just decided to quit, leaving them floating blind in the North Atlantic. I was in command of the USS Holloway, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. We were 2 days out of Reykjavik, patrolling the GIUK Gap, that choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, where the Atlantic breathes its coldest, harshest air. We were hunting submarines, or at least pretending to. It was supposed to be a standard freedom of navigation exercise, a show of force to remind the Russians we were still the apex predators of the deep blue. But then the fog rolled in. This wasn't normal weather. I've sailed through typhoons in the Pacific and snow squalls in the Baltic that cut visibility to zero. This was different. It didn't drift, it consumed. It moved with a predatory speed, a wall of gray wool that swallowed the horizon, then the bow, and finally the bridge windows. Within 10 minutes, I couldn't see the jackstaff on the front of my own ship. "Captain, surface search radar is clogging," the officer of the deck, Lieutenant Evans, said. He was a sharp kid, usually unflappable, but his voice cracked. "Define clogging, Lieutenant," I said, stepping down from the captain's chair. "Clutter, sir. Massive sea return. The scope is just solid white noise. I've tried switching frequencies, adjusting the gain. It's like we're inside a cotton ball." I walked over to the console. He was right. The AN-SP1 radar, the most sophisticated set of eyes ever welded to a hull, was blind.
It looked like we were surrounded by land on all sides, but the charts said we were in 4,000 feet of water, 200 miles from the nearest rock. "What about thermal?" I asked. "Negative, sir. The sensors are washing out. Moisture density is off the charts." We were doing 15 knots, blind. "All stop," I ordered. "Sound the fog signal. 2 prolonged blasts every 2 minutes." The order went out. The ship's inertia carried us forward as the engines declutched and the shafts stopped spinning. The Holloway drifted, settling into the long, slow heave of the Atlantic swell. The foghorn bellowed, a deep, chest-rattling groan that vibrated through the steel deck plates. We waited for an echo, for a reply. Nothing but the wet silence. That's when the feeling started. It wasn't a tactical observation. It wasn't a piece of data I could show to the Commodore back in Norfolk. It was a physical sensation, a cold pressure at the base of my skull. It felt like someone was standing right behind me, breathing on my neck. I looked around the pilot house. The bridge watch team was frozen, staring out into the gray void. The helmsman's knuckles were white on the wheel. The quartermaster was staring at the GPS repeater, which was flickering intermittently. "Sir," the XO whispered, leaning in close. "GPS is drifting. It says we just jumped 3 miles east in 2 seconds. "Atmospherics," I said, trying to sound surer than I felt. "The density of this fog is messing with the signal reception." "Or jamming," the XO suggested. "Who jams GPS in the middle of the Atlantic without a declaration of war?" I countered. But he had a point. The hair on my neck stood up straighter. The silence stretched for 20 minutes. We were a billion-dollar warship, armed with Tomahawk missiles and torpedoes, reduced to a floating cork. Then the junior officer of the deck, JOOD, a young ensign named Miller, spoke up. "Captain,
"Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "I thought I heard machinery off the starboard bow." I stepped out onto the bridge wing. The air was freezing and tasted metallic, like chewing on aluminum foil. I closed my eyes, tuning out the hum of our own ventilation fans, straining to hear over the slap of waves against the hull. Silence. "I don't hear it, Miller," I said, stepping back inside. "I swear, sir, it sounded like a pump, a heavy, rhythmic thumping." I looked at the radar again. White noise. I looked at the sonar repeater. Passive sonar was picking up biologicals, whales, shrimp, but no mechanical transients. If there was a ship out there, it was running on batteries or under sail, which was impossible in these waters. But the feeling at the base of my skull was getting worse. It turned into a headache, a sharp stabbing pain behind my eyes. I felt an overwhelming urge to move, to run. It was the same feeling I'd had in Fallujah years prior.
seconds before an IED took out the Humvee behind mine. It was the survival instinct, the lizard brain screaming that the pattern was wrong. "Right full rudder," I said. The bridge crew looked at me. We were at a dead stop. Turning the rudder wouldn't do anything without propulsion. "Sir?" Evans asked. "All ahead full," I snapped. "Right full rudder. Now." The order was insane. We were blind, surrounded by electronic clutter, with no confirmed contacts. Accelerating into a fog bank is how you end up in a court-martial or at the bottom of the ocean. "Captain, we have no visibility," the XO warned, his voice low. "If we hit something, do it," I roared. The volume of my own voice startled me. I didn't yell. I was known for being the calmest man in the room, but the panic inside me was rising like bile. "Aye, sir. All ahead full. Right full rudder." The lee helmsman shoved the throttles forward. The gas turbine engines, massive jet engines buried deep in the hull, whined to life. The shafts engaged.
The deck shuddered as the screws bit into the water. The Holloway began to surge forward, banking hard to the right as the rudder caught the wash.
We picked up speed. 5 knots, 10 knots. The ship leaned into the turn. "Steady on course 090, I ordered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt foolish. I was maneuvering a 90-100-ton vessel based on a headache and a rookie ensign's auditory hallucination. And then, the fog tore open. It didn't lift. It was as if a giant hand had swiped through the clouds just off our port beam, the exact spot where we would have been sitting if I hadn't ordered the move. The bridge fell silent. Even the breathing stopped. Sliding out of the mist, less than 400 yards away, was a wall of black steel. It was a ship, but not just any ship. It was an ultra-large crude carrier, a supertanker. It was easily a quarter-mile long, riding low in the water, fully laden, and it was completely dark. No running lights, no deck lights, no AIS transponder broadcasting its position. It was a ghost ship running silent, likely smuggling sanctioned oil, trying to slip through the gap unnoticed. Because of the fog, and because it was running dark ship, and perhaps because its massive steel hull was angled in a way that deflected our radar waves, it had been invisible. If we had stayed stopped, drifting in the swell, that monster would have cut us in half. The bow of the tanker sliced through the water where the Holloway had been 60 seconds ago. I watched the massive wake roil and foam, a deadly white scar in the black water. We were close enough that I could see the rust streaks on the hull, close enough to smell the crude oil vapor venting from its tanks. "Jesus Christ," the XO whispered. The tanker disappeared back into the fog as quickly as it had appeared. It never sounded a horn. It never altered course. It just plowed through the ocean like a juggernaut, indifferent to the destruction it had almost caused. "Get me a range and bearing on that wake," I shouted, breaking the trance.
"Sonar, you have to be hearing that now." "Contact!" Sonar screamed over the net. "Master 1, surface contact, strong screw noises, bearing 270, range? My God, range is 500 yards, opening!" The physics of it washed over me. A collision with a ship that size would have crushed the Holloway like a soda can. The kinetic energy of a fully loaded supertanker is incalculable. It wouldn't have just been a fender bender, it would have been a mass casualty event. The hull breach would have flooded the engineering spaces instantly. We would have gone down in minutes in near-freezing water. I gripped the railing of the bridge wing, my hands shaking uncontrollably now that the danger was passing. The headache was gone, instantly. The pressure at the back of my neck had vanished the moment the tanker passed. "Captain," Evans said, his face pale in the glow of the instrument panel. "How did you know?" I looked at him. I looked at the crew. They were looking at me like I was a wizard or a religious figure. "I didn't," I said honestly. "I just didn't like the quiet." We tracked the tanker for another hour, shadowing it from a safe distance until the fog lifted enough to get a visual ID. We radioed the hull number to Fleet Command. Turns out it was a rogue vessel registered in a country that didn't exist anymore, moving illegal crude to a buyer in the North Sea. They were running without lights and radar to avoid detection by satellites. They hadn't seen us either. But that night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my stateroom, staring at the bulkhead. I replayed the moment in my head. The logic of command is binary. You have data, you make a decision. You have rules of engagement, you follow them. But war, and the sea, doesn't always follow binary logic. There is a concept veterans talk about.
usually after 3 or 4 drinks.
We call it the sentry's nudge. It's the idea that when you spend enough time in the zone of death, you tune into a frequency that isn't on the electromagnetic spectrum. Your body becomes an antenna for danger. I thought about Ensign Miller hearing the thumping sound. Maybe he did hear it. Maybe the atmospheric ducting carried the sound of that tanker's engines miles ahead of the ship itself, just for a second. Maybe my brain processed a subtle shift in the swell, a change in the way the ship was rolling, indicating a massive displacement of water nearby, and translated it into a headache. Or maybe, just maybe, the universe allows for 1 or 2 free passes. We finished the patrol. We returned to Norfolk. I got a commendation for expert ship handling in adverse conditions. The citation praised my situational awareness. They wrote it up as if I had analyzed the radar clutter and deduced the threat. I never corrected them. How do you put gut feeling in an official Navy logbook? But here is the part that still keeps me up at night. 2 years later, I was at a retirement party for a Master Chief who had been a sonar tech on the Holloway during that patrol. We were drinking bad beer in a VFW hall. "Captain," he said, swaying a little, "can I ask you something about that night in the gap, the fog?" "Sure, Master Chief." "You ordered the turn before sonar called the contact." "I did."
I assumed you saw the birds, sir. The birds?
Yeah, on the thermal camera tape. About 10 seconds before you ordered the turn, a flock of seagulls, must have been 50 of them, erupted out of the fog directly off the port bow. They were resting on the water, and something disturbed them. They flew right over the bridge. I shook my head. I was inside. I didn't see any birds. He stared at me for a long time. "Then I don't know what to tell you, Cap. But those birds took flight because that tanker bow was plowing right into them. If we hadn't turned, we would have been the bugs on the windshield." I walked out of that bar and looked up at the night sky. I realized then that the miracle wasn't the birds, and it wasn't the tech. The miracle was the terrifying efficiency of the human animal. The sea is vast, and it is old, and it wants to kill you. It hides mountains of steel and clouds of vapor. It freezes your sensors and blinds your eyes. But somewhere deep in the primitive wiring of the brain, there is a sentry that never sleeps. That sentry knew the birds were there, even if I didn't see them. It knew the water was being displaced, even if the sensors didn't register it. It took 1,000 tiny imperceptible inputs, a shift in air pressure, a vibration in the deck, a shadow in the fog, and it screamed one single word into my conscious mind. Move. And because I listened, 300 sailors went home to their families instead of the bottom of the Atlantic. That's the thing about war and about the sea. You can have all the computers, all the satellites, and all the firepower in the world. But sometimes survival comes down to a headache, a bad feeling, and the willingness to look like a fool for 30 seconds to avoid being a ghost for eternity. I still hate the fog. When I see it rolling in now, even from the safety of my front porch, I go inside and lock the door. I turn up the TV. I make noise. Because I know what's hiding in the silence.
And I know that next time, the voice in my head might not speak up fast enough.